Some people think power lives in a badge, but sometimes the real power is standing quietly on the other side of the road. The night air over Maple Avenue carried the soft hum of late traffic and the distant glow of streetlights reflecting off polished metal as a deep black Lamborghini Urus rolled smoothly through the quiet suburban road at a steady 35 miles per hour, its engine barely louder than the whisper of tires on asphalt. Inside the driver's seat sat Marcus Bennett, hands relaxed on the steering wheel, eyes steady on the road ahead after a long day that had stretched from early morning meetings to a late evening drive back toward his new neighborhood on the north side of the city. The dashboard clock read 9:42 p.m. when a pair of flashing red and blue lights suddenly ignited behind him, cutting through the darkness like a signal flare. Marcus glanced into the rearview mirror, calm but observant, watching the patrol cruiser close the distance. For a moment, he wondered if the officer needed to pass. The road was nearly empty, but the cruiser stayed directly behind him, lights spinning with quiet authority. Marcus eased his foot off the accelerator and gently pulled his Lamborghini to the shoulder beneath a tall street lamp, the glow of yellow lights spreading across the sleek curves of the SUV's hood. The patrol car stopped behind him, engine idling, spotlight flicking on, and washing the rear of the Lamborghini in harsh white light. The driver's door of the cruiser opened and Officer Daniel Carter stepped out, adjusting his duty belt as he approached. Carter had been on the force for nearly 8 years, long enough to believe he could read a situation the moment he saw it. And what he saw now made him narrow his eyes. A black man, alone, in a $200,000 SUV. To Carter, the picture didn't add up. His boots tapped steadily against the pavement as he walked toward the driver's window, his expression already shaped by a conclusion he hadn't bothered to question. Marcus lowered the window halfway, the cool night air slipping inside the vehicle as Carter leaned slightly toward the opening. "Evening," Carter said, though the words sounded less like a greeting and more like an inspection. Marcus nodded politely. "Good evening, officer." Carter glanced slowly across the interior of the vehicle, taking in the leather seats, the glowing digital dashboard, the quiet confidence of a car built for people who had somewhere important to be. His gaze returned to Marcus. License and registration. Marcus reached calmly for his wallet, moving carefully and deliberately, the same way anyone would when speaking to a police officer on the side of the road. Carter studied him the entire time, the silence stretching just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Carter finally asked. Marcus handed over the license. "No, sir, I don't." Carter looked down briefly at the card, then back at Marcus, skepticism tightening his expression. "This your vehicle?" The question lingered in the air longer than necessary. Marcus answered evenly. "Yes, it is." Carter tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the response against his own private expectations. The Lamborghini's engine purred quietly in the background while a car passed slowly in the opposite lane, its headlights sweeping across the scene before disappearing down the road. Carter shifted his stance. "Step out of the vehicle." The request came abruptly, firm enough to sound less like a question and more like a decision that had already been made. Marcus paused for half a second, studying the officer's face with calm curiosity, then opened the door and stepped onto the pavement beneath the streetlight. The cool breeze moved through the trees lining the road as Carter circled the Lamborghini, his flashlight beam sliding across the body panels, the rims, the tinted windows. To Carter, something about the situation still didn't feel right. Or maybe it simply didn't match the story he had already decided in his head. Marcus stood beside the road with quiet patience, hands relaxed at his sides, watching the officer inspect the vehicle like someone determined to prove a point. After a moment Marcus spoke, his tone calm, almost conversational. "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran the beam of his flashlight across the windshield, then turned back toward Marcus with a look that suggested the night had just become far more interesting for him. What Officer Carter didn't realize, standing there under the streetlight on Maple Avenue, was that the man he had just ordered out of that Lamborghini was about to change the direction of his entire career. Officer Daniel Carter kept the flashlight steady as the narrow beam traced the sharp lines of the Lamborghini Urus, gliding across the hood and down the side panels as though he expected the metal itself to confess something. The street remained quiet except for the soft hum of the engine and the distant sound of another car turning somewhere a few blocks away. Marcus Bennett stood calmly beside the vehicle beneath the streetlight, his posture relaxed, his expression steady, watching the officer examine the car with growing determination. Carter finally lowered the flashlight and looked back at Marcus with a skeptical expression that had clearly hardened since the stop began. "You said this vehicle belongs to you?" Carter asked again, his voice slow and deliberate. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, officer. It does." Carter glanced down the length of the Lamborghini again, clearly weighing the answer against whatever assumption had already formed in his mind. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Bennett?" he asked, reading the name from the license he still held in his hand. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Public service." Carter raised one eyebrow slightly. The answer did not satisfy him. "Public service is a broad description," he replied. "Care to be more specific?" Marcus kept his tone calm. "I work in law enforcement." Carter let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a skeptical chuckle. "Law enforcement," he repeated slowly, as though testing the words for authenticity. The beam of the flashlight moved again across the vehicle as Carter circled toward the rear, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement. "You mind telling me how someone working in law enforcement ends up driving something like this?" Marcus looked at the officer for a moment before responding. "Is that a problem, officer?" Carter stopped walking and turned back toward him. The silence stretched just long enough to make the air feel heavier beneath the streetlight. "That depends," Carter said. "Because situations like this sometimes raise questions." A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching slowly before passing them on the opposite side of the road. The driver glanced briefly at the scene before continuing down Maple Avenue. Carter stepped closer to the back of the Lamborghini and shined his flashlight through the rear window. The interior remained perfectly still and clean, every surface reflecting the light with polished precision. "I'm going to take a closer look inside the vehicle," Carter said after a moment. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Officer, may I ask if there is a specific reason for that?" Carter looked back at him with a firm expression. "Just making sure everything checks out." Marcus held the officer's gaze calmly. "Are you saying there is probable cause?" Carter did not answer the question directly. Instead, he reached for the driver's side door handle. Marcus spoke again, his voice still respectful but unmistakably clear. "Officer Carter, I want to make sure we are both following the law here tonight." Hearing his name made Carter pause for half a second before glancing back at Marcus with visible curiosity. "You seem to know a lot about procedure," Carter said. Marcus gave a small nod. Enough to recognize when something does not feel right. The street light above them flickered faintly in the breeze as Carter considered the situation. For reasons he could not fully explain, Marcus Bennett's calm confidence seemed to irritate him more with every passing second. It was the kind of quiet composure that made Carter feel as though the man standing in front of him knew something that he did not. Carter folded Marcus's license between two fingers and tapped it lightly against his palm. "Let me make something clear," he said. "When an officer asks questions during a traffic stop, cooperation usually makes things easier." Marcus did not raise his voice or show any sign of frustration. Instead, he simply nodded once more. "I am cooperating, officer." Carter studied him again beneath the harsh white beam of the flashlight. The calm tone, the steady eye contact, the complete absence of nervousness. None of it matched the situation Carter believed he had encountered, and that only made him more determined to push further. "Step a little farther away from the vehicle," Carter instructed, motioning toward the curb. Marcus slowly moved a few feet back, giving the officer space while remaining under the glow of the streetlight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus asked quietly, "Officer Carter, how long have you been on the force?" Carter glanced at him with mild suspicion. "Long enough," he answered. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as though filing the answer away somewhere. What Officer Carter still did not realize was that the quiet man standing beside that Lamborghini was watching every decision he made, and each passing moment was revealing far more about the officer than Carter had ever intended to show. Officer Daniel Carter kept Marcus Bennett's driver license between his fingers as the quiet night stretched around them, the streetlight humming softly above Maple Avenue, while the Lamborghini Urus reflected thin lines of yellow light across its polished black surface. Carter looked at the license again, then back at Marcus, still standing calmly a few feet from the vehicle. There was something about the man's composure that refused to match the story Carter had already decided this situation should be. Most drivers showed some kind of tension during a stop like this. They shifted their weight. They spoke too quickly. They tried to explain themselves before the officer even asked a question. Marcus Bennett did none of those things. He simply stood there with quiet patience, watching every movement with steady attention. Carter slid the license into the small notepad he carried and tapped it lightly against his palm again. "You say you work in law enforcement," Carter said slowly. "But you did not say where." Marcus answered evenly. "In this city." Carter narrowed his eyes slightly. "That still leaves a lot of possibilities." Marcus gave a small nod. "It does." The brief exchange only seemed to deepen Carter's suspicion. To him, the calm responses felt less like cooperation and more like someone carefully choosing how much information to reveal. Carter turned toward the Lamborghini again and ran the flashlight beam across the driver door and along the edge of the windshield. The glass was spotless. The interior looked untouched. No clutter. No sign of anything unusual. Yet Carter continued inspecting as if he expected something to appear if he looked long enough. "Mind telling me where you are coming from tonight?" Carter asked without looking back. Marcus answered in the same steady tone. "From work." Carter paused and glanced over his shoulder. "That is a short answer." Marcus shrugged slightly. "It is the honest one." Carter walked toward the rear of the vehicle again, shining the flashlight through the tinted back window, even though the interior was already clearly visible beneath the streetlight. "You know," Carter said after a moment, "most people driving a vehicle like this are either professional athletes, business executives, or people who work in technology." Marcus watched him calmly. "There are many different paths in this country, officer." Carter gave a quiet breath through his nose as though the answer had only confirmed the doubt already forming in his mind. "Step back another few feet," Carter said, motioning farther toward the curb. Marcus took another step away from the Lamborghini without protest. The road remained quiet, the distant glow of houses visible through rows of trees lining the neighborhood. Carter reached for the driver's side door again and opened it halfway, letting the flashlight beam sweep across the dashboard and seats. The interior lighting softly illuminated the cabin, revealing nothing except the clean design of a luxury vehicle. Carter leaned slightly closer, studying the center console and floor area. "Interesting car for someone in public service," he said, almost to himself. Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Carter carefully, as if measuring each decision the officer made. After a moment, Marcus spoke in a calm, thoughtful voice. "Officer Carter, do you believe a person's job determines what they are allowed to own?" Carter straightened and turned toward him. "I believe unusual situations deserve closer attention," he replied. Marcus nodded slowly, considering the answer. The quiet confidence in his posture had not changed since the moment the stop began. If anything, the longer the encounter continued, the more it seemed that Marcus was observing something deeper than the inspection of a vehicle. Carter closed the driver door halfway, but kept his hand resting on the frame. "Tell me something, Mr. Bennett," he said. "If you work in law enforcement, which department?" Marcus held the officer's gaze for a few seconds before answering. "You will find out soon enough." Carter frowned slightly at the response. It was not refusal. It was not defiance. It was something stranger, almost like a quiet certainty that the conversation was heading somewhere Carter had not yet realized. A faint breeze moved down Maple Avenue, rustling the leaves of the tall trees beside the road. Carter stepped away from the Lamborghini again and looked toward Marcus with a firm expression. "For now," Carter said, "I am going to take a closer look inside the vehicle." Marcus remained completely still beneath the streetlight. "Officer Carter," he said calmly, "are you certain that is the direction you want this stop to go?" Carter stared at him for a moment, unsure why the simple question sounded less like concern and more like a warning he did not yet understand. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the open driver's side door of the Lamborghini Urus, the flashlight still in his hand as the narrow beam moved slowly across the immaculate interior. The cabin looked exactly like what it was designed to be, quiet, precise, and untouched by anything suspicious. The leather seats reflected the faint glow of the dashboard lights, while the center console remained perfectly organized. Carter leaned slightly closer, inspecting the floor area, the cup holders, and the glove compartment with careful attention. Nothing about the vehicle suggested anything illegal, but the longer he looked, the more determined he seemed to justify the stop he had already made. Behind him, Marcus Bennett remained beneath the streetlight, standing calmly with his hands relaxed at his sides. The breeze carried the faint scent of warm pavement and distant traffic, while the quiet neighborhood around Maple Avenue remained undisturbed. Carter straightened slightly and looked back toward Marcus. "You asked if I was sure about this direction," he said slowly. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Bennett. When an officer conducts a traffic stop, we are responsible for making sure everything checks out." Marcus listened without interrupting. His expression did not change. "I understand the responsibilities of an officer," Marcus replied calmly. Carter tilted his head a little, as if the answer confirmed something he had been suspecting. "Then you should also understand that cooperation helps resolve situations like this faster." Marcus gave a small nod. "I have been cooperating the entire time." Carter looked at him for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the vehicle. The flashlight beam moved again along the inside of the door panel and across the steering wheel. Carter's posture carried the quiet determination of someone who believed he was proving a point, even if that point had not yet revealed itself. Another car passed slowly on the opposite side of the road, the driver briefly glancing toward the flashing patrol lights before continuing down the street. The neighborhood remained otherwise silent. Carter closed the driver's side door halfway, but did not shut it completely. Instead, he walked around the front of the Lamborghini again, studying the vehicle as though the polished black paint itself held unanswered questions. The bright streetlight above them cast long shadows across the pavement as Carter stopped near the front bumper and folded his arms for a moment. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most people in your position would be a little more concerned about what is happening right now." Marcus responded in the same steady voice he had used since the stop began. "Concern usually comes from uncertainty. I am not uncertain about anything tonight." Carter raised an eyebrow at the answer. It sounded less like confidence and more like quiet assurance, and that only seemed to irritate him further. He stepped closer again, the flashlight now lowered at his side. "You seem very sure of yourself, Mr. Bennett." Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "Confidence is not the same thing as disrespect, officer." Carter looked down briefly at the driver license still tucked inside his notepad before glancing back up. The name Marcus Bennett was printed clearly across the card, along with a city address that Carter had not yet taken the time to examine carefully. "Tell me something," Carter said. "If you work in law enforcement in this city, how is it that I have never seen you before?" Marcus answered calmly. "This city has thousands of officers and employees across multiple divisions. It would not be unusual for two professionals to cross paths for the first time." Carter studied him for several seconds, clearly weighing the response. The confidence in Marcus's tone made it difficult to treat the situation like an ordinary stop, yet Carter seemed unwilling to step back from the direction he had chosen. Finally, he spoke again. "For now, I am going to continue making sure everything here is in order." Marcus nodded slightly. "That is your decision." The words were simple, but something about the way Marcus said them made the moment feel heavier than before. Carter did not fully understand why. The quiet man standing beneath the streetlight did not argue, did not raise his voice, and did not show the slightest sign of frustration. Yet the calm certainty in his presence carried the strange feeling that the situation had already begun moving toward a conclusion Carter had not yet seen coming. The quiet stretch of Maple Avenue seemed to grow even stiller as Officer Daniel Carter slowly walked another circle around the Lamborghini Urus, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement while the flashing patrol lights painted the black paint with slow pulses of red and blue. The vehicle remained exactly as it had been from the moment the stop began, clean, silent, and undeniably impressive beneath the glow of the streetlight. Carter paused near the rear quarter panel and glanced back toward Marcus Bennett, who still stood calmly several feet away from the vehicle with the same steady posture he had maintained since stepping out of the driver's seat. Not once had Marcus raised his voice, and not once had he shown frustration. That quiet composure had begun to feel less like patience and more like something Carter could not quite define. Carter cleared his throat slightly and held up the driver license again. "Marcus Bennett," he said, reading the name aloud as though repeating it might somehow reveal something new. "You said you work in law enforcement." Marcus nodded once. "That is correct." Carter studied him carefully. "And yet you still have not said where." Marcus looked at the patrol car lights reflecting across the pavement for a moment before answering calmly. "I believe I mentioned that you would find out soon enough." Carter's expression tightened. The answer felt controlled, almost deliberate. the kind of answer that made an officer feel as though he was the one being evaluated. Carter stepped closer again, stopping just a few feet from Marcus beneath the streetlight. "Let me ask you something directly," Carter said. "If you are part of law enforcement in this city, why are you being so careful with your answers tonight?" Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. "Because details matter, officer. Especially when procedures are involved." Carter folded his arms briefly, studying the man standing in front of him. The calm tone, the measured words, the complete absence of nervousness. None of it fit the situation Carter believed he had discovered when he first saw the Lamborghini driving down Maple Avenue. "You seem very familiar with procedures," Carter said slowly. Marcus gave a slight nod. "I make it a point to be." Carter exhaled quietly and glanced back at the vehicle again. The Lamborghini's headlights reflected faintly off the road ahead, while the patrol car behind it continued flashing steadily into the dark street. Carter walked toward the driver's side door once more, his flashlight beam returning to the interior as if searching for something that had not yet appeared. He leaned slightly closer to the steering wheel and dashboard before straightening again. Still nothing unusual. No sign of anything suspicious. Just a luxury vehicle sitting quietly beneath the streetlight. Carter shut the driver's side door completely this time and turned back toward Marcus. "You asked earlier if I was sure about how this stop was going," Carter said. Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes, I did." Carter took a step closer, his tone firm but controlled. "Let me explain something clearly. When an officer notices something that does not seem right, it is our responsibility to look into it. That is how law enforcement works." Marcus listened carefully and then answered with the same calm clarity. "Law enforcement also works best when decisions are based on facts." Carter held his gaze for several seconds, the quiet tension between them growing heavier beneath the flickering streetlight. Finally, Carter spoke again. "And what facts do you think I should be looking at right now?" Marcus looked briefly at the patrol lights reflecting across the hood of the Lamborghini before returning his attention to the officer. "The facts that led to the stop in the first place," he said. Carter's jaw tightened slightly at the response. The question had been simple, but Marcus's answer carried the quiet weight of something deeper. Carter reached down and adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder, though he did not press the button yet. The moment felt strange, as if the situation had gradually shifted into something far more complicated than an ordinary traffic stop. Marcus watched him carefully, his calm expression unchanged. After a few seconds he spoke again, his voice low but steady. "Officer Carter, may I ask you one more question?" Carter looked back at him cautiously. "Go ahead." Marcus paused briefly before speaking. "How confident are you about every decision you have made since you turned on those lights behind my vehicle?" The question lingered in the quiet night air, and for the first time since the stop began, Officer Daniel Carter found himself wondering whether the answer might matter more than he originally thought. Officer Daniel Carter did not answer immediately. The question Marcus Bennett had just asked seemed simple on the surface, yet it carried a weight that settled quietly into the air between them. The flashing patrol lights continued their steady rhythm behind the Lamborghini Urus, sending slow waves of red and blue across the pavement, while the streetlight above Maple Avenue flickered faintly in the warm night breeze. Carter studied Marcus carefully, trying to decide whether the calm tone he heard was confidence or something else entirely. "I am confident enough to do my job," Carter finally replied. Marcus nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the answer without challenging it. "That is good to hear," he said calmly. Carter glanced once more toward the Lamborghini, his eyes moving across the polished hood and along the side mirrors reflecting the patrol lights. Everything about the vehicle still appeared exactly as it had from the beginning. Clean, orderly, undeniably expensive. Carter shifted his stance and rested one hand lightly on his duty belt while the other still held the flashlight. "Let me ask you something now," Carter said. "If you understand law enforcement procedures as well as you claim, then you should understand that unusual situations invite closer inspection." Marcus looked at the vehicle for a moment and then back at Carter. "And what part of this situation feels unusual to you, officer?" Carter hesitated briefly before answering. "A $200,000 SUV being driven through this neighborhood late at night by someone who has not clearly identified his position in law enforcement." Marcus listened without interrupting. The breeze moved softly through the trees lining the road, carrying the faint rustle of leaves above them. "I see," Marcus said after a moment. Carter watched him carefully. You do not seem surprised by that answer. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful nod. No, I am not. Carter's expression tightened slightly. The calm responses were beginning to feel like quiet challenges, even though Marcus had not raised his voice once. Carter looked down briefly at the license still in his notepad, and then slipped it back into his pocket temporarily. I am going to run your information through the system, Carter said. Standard procedure. Marcus nodded. Of course. Carter turned and walked a few steps toward the patrol cruiser parked behind the Lamborghini. The spotlight remained fixed on the rear of the vehicle while the flashing lights painted the quiet street with alternating color. Carter opened the driver door of the cruiser and leaned inside, speaking briefly into the radio microphone mounted near the dashboard. His voice was calm and controlled as he read the name and license number into the system, requesting verification. For a moment, the only sound was the faint static of the radio waiting for a response. Marcus remained where he stood beneath the streetlight, watching the patrol car with quiet patience. He did not pace. He did not check his watch. He simply waited, as though the outcome of the radio call was something he already understood. Carter listened carefully as the radio finally crackled with a response from dispatch. The voice on the other end began reading back the information connected to the driver license number. Carter's expression shifted slightly as he listened. Not shock, not confusion, just the faintest sign that the information he was hearing had not been what he expected. Carter leaned closer to the radio and asked dispatch to repeat part of the record. The voice repeated the information clearly. Carter straightened slowly in the seat and looked out through the windshield toward Marcus Bennett, standing beneath the streetlight. For the first time since the stop began, the certainty Carter had carried into the situation seemed to loosen slightly. He stepped out of the cruiser again and closed the door behind him, the radio still murmuring faintly inside the vehicle. Marcus watched him approach without changing his posture. Carter walked halfway back toward the Lamborghini before stopping. Mr. Bennett, he said carefully. Marcus looked at him calmly. Yes, officer. Carter studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding how much of the information he had just heard should be addressed right away. Then he spoke again. Dispatch confirmed your identification. Marcus nodded slightly. I expected they would. Carter held his gaze beneath the flickering streetlight, the quiet tension between them now carrying a different weight than before. There is something else they mentioned, Carter said slowly. Marcus tilted his head just slightly. I imagine there is. Carter paused for a brief moment before continuing. They said your name is connected to a recent administrative appointment within the department. Marcus looked at the patrol lights reflecting across the road before returning his attention to the officer. His voice remained calm, steady, and almost reflective. Yes, he said. That is correct. Carter stood silently for a moment longer, the meaning of that answer beginning to settle into the quiet night air around Maple Avenue. Officer Daniel Carter stood beneath the streetlight on Maple Avenue with the quiet weight of dispatch's words still echoing in his mind. The night felt different now, though nothing around them had changed. The patrol lights continued to flash in slow red and blue waves across the pavement. The Lamborghini Urus remained parked, exactly where Marcus Bennett had pulled over, its dark paint reflecting the lights like a mirror. Yet something inside Carter's understanding of the situation had shifted. He studied Marcus again, this time with a longer pause than before. Marcus still stood calmly several feet away from the vehicle, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture composed in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The calm confidence that had irritated Carter earlier now carried a different meaning. Carter cleared his throat quietly. Dispatch mentioned something about an administrative appointment, he said slowly, choosing his words with more care than before. Marcus looked at him with the same steady expression. Yes, they did. Carter glanced briefly back toward the patrol cruiser, as if confirming to himself that the radio transmission had been real. The breeze moved gently through the trees along the street, causing the leaves to rustle softly above them. Carter shifted his weight and looked at Marcus again. You did not mention that earlier, he said. Marcus answered without hesitation. You did not ask the right question. The words were calm, but they landed with quiet precision. Carter looked at him carefully, trying to understand whether the statement had been intended as criticism or simple observation. Marcus did not appear confrontational. If anything, his tone remained thoughtful, almost patient. Carter ran a hand briefly along the edge of his duty belt, a habit that officers often develop when processing new information. Dispatch said the appointment is recent, Carter continued. Very recent. Marcus nodded once. That is correct. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as he tried to connect the information with the man standing in front of him. The stop that had started as routine suspicion now felt like the opening scene of something he had not fully understood. Carter stepped a little closer beneath the streetlight, the glow revealing more detail in Marcus's expression. There was no anger there, no frustration, only quiet awareness. What kind of administrative role are we talking about? Carter asked. Marcus looked down Maple Avenue for a moment, watching the empty stretch of road disappear into the dark neighborhood ahead. When he spoke again, his voice remained steady, one that involves responsibility for the department. Carter felt a small pause settle into the air. The phrase was simple, but it carried more meaning than Marcus had openly explained. Carter crossed his arms briefly, then uncrossed them, again as if unsure how to continue the conversation. Responsibility for the department, he repeated slowly. Marcus nodded again. Yes. Carter glanced once more at the Lamborghini, the patrol car, and the empty road around them. The quiet setting made the moment feel unusually focused, as though the entire street had narrowed down to the two men standing beneath that single streetlight. You seem very certain about how this conversation is going, Carter said after a moment. Marcus answered calmly. I am certain about the facts. Carter let out a slow breath through his nose. The tension in the air had changed. Earlier he had believed he was controlling the direction of the stop. Now it felt more like he was slowly uncovering a situation that had been far more complex from the beginning. Carter looked back toward the patrol cruiser again, remembering the exact words dispatch had used during the radio call. Administrative appointment. Department leadership. Effective immediately. The phrases returned to his mind one by one. He turned his attention back to Marcus. Mr. Bennett, Carter said carefully. Dispatch also mentioned that the appointment becomes official tonight. Marcus gave a small nod. Yes, tonight. Carter hesitated before speaking again. And this role you mentioned, he said slowly, involves authority within the department? Marcus looked directly at him. It does. The quiet night air seemed to hold the moment still for a few seconds longer. Carter studied Marcus Bennett once more, this time not as a suspicious driver beside an expensive vehicle, but as someone whose presence on Maple Avenue might carry far more significance than he had originally believed. And for the first time since the patrol lights had turned on behind that Lamborghini, Officer Daniel Carter began to understand that the situation standing in front of him might be far bigger than a routine traffic stop. Officer Daniel Carter remained standing beneath the streetlight as the meaning of the conversation slowly settled around him. The quiet road on Maple Avenue felt almost suspended in time. The red and blue reflections from the patrol cruiser sliding across the glossy surface of the Lamborghini Urus, while the warm summer air carried the soft rustling of tree leaves overhead. Carter looked at Marcus Bennett again, but this time the look was different from the one he had worn earlier in the stop. The certainty that had once guided his questions was now being replaced by a careful kind of attention. Marcus had not moved from his place near the curb. His posture remained calm, steady, and composed, as if the moment unfolding beneath the streetlight was exactly where he expected to be. Carter cleared his throat quietly before speaking. Dispatch said the appointment becomes official tonight, he repeated slowly. Marcus gave a small nod. Yes, it does. Carter studied him carefully. You mentioned responsibility for the department. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. That is correct. Carter felt the weight of the conversation shifting further with every answer Marcus gave. The stop that had started with suspicion now felt like a test of understanding he had not realized he was taking. Carter glanced back briefly toward the patrol cruiser where the radio inside still murmured softly with distant background traffic from dispatch. Then he turned his attention back to Marcus. When dispatch mentioned your name, Carter said, they also used a specific title. Marcus waited patiently. Carter continued carefully. They said the department recently appointed a new chief. The words hung in the quiet night air. The flashing lights reflected across the pavement again, painting brief streaks of color across Marcus's shoes and the curb beside him. Marcus Bennett did not appear surprised by the statement. Instead, he nodded slowly, acknowledging the information with quiet certainty. Carter watched him closely. And they said that appointment became effective tonight. Marcus spoke in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning of the stop. That is correct. Carter felt the realization forming fully now, each piece of information aligning with the calm confidence Marcus had carried since the moment the patrol lights first appeared behind the Lamborghini. The careful answers, the measured tone, the quiet certainty that had never wavered. Carter looked at Marcus for several seconds without speaking. The street remained silent except for the soft hum of the patrol car engine behind them. Finally Carter spoke again, this time with a noticeably different tone. "Mr. Bennett," he said slowly, "are you telling me that you are the new chief of this department?" Marcus did not rush to answer. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the patrol cruiser and then back at the officer standing beneath the streetlight. When he spoke, his voice remained calm but carried a quiet authority that had been present all along. "Yes, Officer Carter," he said. "That is exactly what I am telling you." The moment that followed seemed to stretch across the quiet road. Carter felt the meaning settle heavily into the space around them. The driver he had stopped on Maple Avenue. The man he had questioned about his vehicle and his profession. The man who had stood calmly through every assumption and every inspection. Carter slowly straightened his posture without fully realizing he was doing it. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he stood, composed and steady beneath the glow of the streetlight. The flashing patrol lights continued their slow rhythm behind the Lamborghini, but now the scene felt completely different from the moment the stop began. Carter finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Chief Bennett." Marcus nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Neither man moved for a moment. The quiet neighborhood road, the expensive vehicle, the patrol cruiser, and the single streetlight above them had all become witnesses to a realization that Officer Daniel Carter had not expected when he first activated his lights behind that black Lamborghini. For several seconds after the words were spoken, the quiet stretch of Maple Avenue seemed to hold its breath. Officer Daniel Carter stood beneath the streetlight with the slow realization settling fully into place. The man he had questioned about his vehicle, the man he had inspected with suspicion, the man he had asked to step away from his own car on the side of the road, was now standing in front of him not just as a driver, but as the newly appointed chief of the very department Carter served. The flashing patrol lights continued to cast red and blue reflections across the pavement and along the smooth curves of the Lamborghini Urus, but the atmosphere of the stop had completely changed. Carter adjusted his posture instinctively, standing straighter now as he looked at Marcus Bennett with a very different understanding than he had only minutes earlier. Marcus remained calm and composed beneath the warm glow of the streetlight, his expression steady and thoughtful rather than triumphant. He did not appear interested in embarrassing the officer or escalating the moment. Instead, he looked around the quiet neighborhood street for a moment, taking in the scene as if considering what it represented. Finally, Carter spoke, his voice quieter than before but clear. "Chief Bennett," he said carefully, the title now spoken with full awareness. Marcus acknowledged him with a small nod. "Officer Carter." The tone of Marcus's reply carried calm authority, but also a surprising sense of patience. Carter glanced briefly toward the Lamborghini and then back at Marcus. "I did not realize who you were earlier," Carter said. Marcus answered calmly. "No, you did not." Carter shifted his weight slightly, aware now of every decision he had made since activating his patrol lights. The questions, the assumptions, the inspection of the vehicle. Each moment replayed quietly in his mind. Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Officer Carter, traffic stops are part of the job. Officers are expected to observe and evaluate situations." Carter nodded once, listening carefully. Marcus continued in the same calm tone. "But the law does not operate on assumptions. It operates on facts, procedure, and respect." The words were not spoken with anger. They carried the steady clarity of someone who understood exactly why the moment mattered. Carter looked down the empty road for a second before returning his attention to Marcus. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Marcus glanced briefly at the patrol cruiser and the flashing lights still illuminating the street. "Tonight is my first official night as chief," he said. "And the first lesson I see in front of me is a reminder that authority must always be balanced with judgment." Carter listened without interrupting. Marcus's voice remained calm, almost reflective. A badge gives an officer responsibility. But responsibility means making sure that every decision is guided by fairness, not assumptions. The breeze moved softly through the trees above them again, carrying the quiet sound of leaves rustling in the warm night air. Carter slowly reached toward the patrol cruiser and switched off the flashing lights. The red and blue reflections faded, leaving only the steady glow of the streetlight over the two men and the parked Lamborghini. The road returned to the peaceful silence it had held before the stop began. Carter looked back at Marcus. "You are free to go, Chief Bennett," he said respectfully. Marcus nodded once more before turning toward the Lamborghini. He opened the driver door and paused briefly, looking back toward Carter with a final calm expression. "Officer Carter," he said, "the best officers are the ones who remember that the law belongs to everyone." Carter stood quietly beneath the streetlight as Marcus stepped into the driver's seat and started the engine. The Lamborghini's quiet power returned with a smooth hum before the vehicle eased forward onto Maple Avenue and disappeared into the dark road ahead. Carter remained there for a moment longer beside his patrol cruiser, reflecting on everything that had unfolded in the span of a single stop. Earlier that night, he believed the badge on his uniform represented control over the situation in front of him. But under that streetlight on Maple Avenue, he had learned something far more important. Real authority was not proven